I am loving.
I am fabulous.
I am beautiful.
I am saved.
I am a victor.
I am faithful.
I am devout.
I am accepted.
I am a Christian. I am MCC.
And I am MCC.
I am MCC.
I am MCC.
And I am MCC.
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 Isang uri ng pagkain na tira-tira na kinakain ng mga tao na marami pa, mga basta mga outlet ng mga chicken, tapos chicken nugget, burger. Nahakot namin tapos pinipilian. Tapos pinipenta namin. Para sa akin, pwedeng oo, pwede rin hindi. Kasi, wala nang kailangan pang mag-i-amper-amper.
That is in one of the slum areas in the Philippines. And those folks are some of the 23 million Filipinos who are considered to be poor or extremely poor as of last year's poverty data released by the government of the Philippines. But of course, numbers would be much higher in reality. And human rights activists in the Philippines would say that about 60 to 70% of Filipinos are either a little bit poor, or extremely poor, like that one. And in Houston, I just got this from Google, and there's about 2.31 million. I don't know how accurate this is. Houstonians, and 21% are poor, living in poverty, or about 400,000 people. And the UN, the United Nations, this year released their data, poverty data globally, and there's about 1.3 billion people around the world who are considered to be poor or extremely poor. 60% of people who experienced hunger were women. And there are even claims that every 5 to 10 seconds, there is a child that dies of hunger or hunger-related causes. Or that's about 16,000 children every single day. And we also know that as climate change worsens, poverty and suffering of many people will be worsened. One of the first things that we learn in seminary, when I was first-year seminary in biblical studies, or we will read in some of our books, would be that Matthew was written primarily for the Jewish Christians. So the entire Gospel of Matthew was intended for the Jewish Christians, while the Gospel of Luke, where our story today is uniquely located, is for Gentile Christian, non-Jewish Christians. But I think reading the entire Gospel of Luke, I don't think the author of Luke was writing primarily with the intention of the Gentileness, the non-Jewishness of the audience that he is writing to. I think he was writing primarily for the poor and the oppressed, and whether they were Jewish or Gentile. And certainly, Jesus and the entire ministry of Jesus, the mission of Jesus, was for the poor, the oppressed, and the marginalized. Now, the book that was mentioned earlier, The Parables of Jesus, the author Amy Jill Levine says that the parables of Jesus, when it was told back then, was about the real life stories of people. It was what they witnessed, what they experienced, and that Jesus telling this story and the authors writing about it intended the stories to offend some people. The parables were intended to challenge some people. And certainly the parables were told and written to inspire the oppressed and the marginalized. And so let's go to the story. Just a little recap. So we know that there was this homeless man named Lazarus. And Lazarus comes from the Hebrew word Eleazar, which means God helps, or God is my help. And in the story, we heard that Lazarus was at the gate of the property, the house of the rich man. And that he longed, he desired to eat from the food that fell from the table of the rich man. Possibly the ones that fell were the ones that were thrown out into the garbage from which Lazarus or Eleazar fed himself. The rich man, we hear, is someone who wears fine purple linen cloth. Now, the rich man here, that gives us a clue, according to biblical scholars, that when you say someone who wears purple cloth is not someone who I would think is, in today's standards, present here. No one here would be considered as the rich man in the story, because to wear purple cloth back then was reserved for those who can afford it, those whose wealth are synonymous to the emperor or the Senate, the senators of the Roman Empire, or the religious leaders. So these are rich men whose wealth and abundance were so much that they can control the world. But that doesn't mean that we are not responsible, according to this story. It doesn't mean that we do not have accountability. And in the story, we hear also that the only friends, the only company of Lazarus was the dogs. Maybe homeless themselves, they were looking for food and finding none. They saw Lazarus and licked the blood, the sores, the wound that is on the skin of Lazarus. But I could not help but think that some dogs today have better living condition than most humans. Some dogs have better health care than most humans. And my New Testament professor, Revelation Velunta, says that when he was writing about this story for a sermon, says, let's get to the emphasis of the storyteller, which the storyteller or the writer or Jesus says that the condition of Lazarus, describe the condition of Lazarus as evil. The gospel writer says that the life situation of Lazarus was evil. So much so that when he died, the storyteller never mentions that he got buried. The rich man got buried in the story, but there was no mention of Lazarus getting buried. And to the Gospel of Luke, this kind of life is evil. Lazarus continues to be among us today. There are so many Eleazars in our world and society today. Those whose only help, whose only hope is in God. Have you ever heard that statement before? That phrase? Those whose hope is only in God. That they are in a life situation so desperate, so hopeless, that there is nothing and no one in this world that seems to be a solution for their problems. The woman said, well, maybe it's fair, maybe it's unfair. I don't know. Who is to blame for our condition? There are those whose it feels as if God is their only hope. And you don't have to necessarily be poor. Have you ever had that experience, a life situation in the past, or maybe now, I don't know, where you felt like no one and nothing in this world seems to solve your problem or your condition? If you have ever experienced that, then you would understand to a certain degree what those people that you just saw in the video would be feeling. But today, the rich man is also among our midst. The rich man was never named. Today, the rich man has names. They have names. They have addresses. They have big, big gates. And they have offices in the centers of power and economy, not just in the US, but in many places of the world. And this rich man who holds 90% of the wealth of the world or of the nations, the system that they sell to us would have us believe that these are the way things are. That there will always be poor, that God ordained that some must suffer and others must live in luxury. This is just the way the world works. Worst, some of us are led to believe that poverty is sin. The religion of our economy tells us that to be poor is sin. Oh, you're just lazy. That's why you're poor. Or some churches would proclaim the prosperity gospel, saying that if you don't have a big, big house or 5 cars or a certain kind of luxury item, you must not be blessed by God. And therefore you are poor, and therefore you must be sinful because God is not blessing you. They would have us believe that. Yet this parable of Jesus and many other things that is said about him and said by him in the 4 different gospel accounts tell otherwise. And there is no going around this story. There is no theological, biblical gymnastics to go around this story. There is no way to absolve the rich who does not care for the poor. The rich who does not care for the poor and homeless like Lazarus. And certainly, it's not just about not caring. It's not just about not caring. There is no justification for the rich whose wealth comes from the exploitation of people. Was that a year ago or 2 years ago, Thor Ragnarok? Have you watched Thor Ragnarok? And there was a scene there where Hela goes into the throne room of Loki. So goes to the throne room of the king, and she destroys the fresco at the ceiling to reveal the earlier painting, the earlier fresco. And then Thor comes in, and Hela explains to Thor that there was once a time before you were born that me and our father conquer the worlds of the universe. And that, where do you think all the gold came from? Our kingdom was built upon the blood of the many peoples of the world. But this is not just about the rich and the powerful. It is also about the church. Is the church without guilt? We who claim to be followers of the one who told this story, do we not have the greater burden of this story? The church and many churches are also under judgment by this parable of Lazarus. Many churches are culpable themselves. For how many churches enrich themselves over the centuries, selling indulgences, selling positions of power? How many churches were involved in colonizing many countries of the world, taking land, people, and resources to enrich themselves? And how many churches in your own history the American history, how many churches benefited from the transatlantic slave trade? And today, those who proclaim and peddle the gospel of prosperity, the gospel of mammon, are the ones who are ignoring the plight of the poor, the oppressed, the refugees, and the asylum seekers. And the funny thing is that many churches today would use all their resources, all their energy for what they imagine to be a warfare, a spiritual warfare against the gay agenda. What I found out, I attended a marriage equality meeting, and what I found out was that some folks in America, in the US, are actually funding other conservative Christians elsewhere so that marriage equality will not spill out into the other nations of the world. And so the church is obsessed with who sleeps with who, when, and where. And the irony of it is that the greatest sexual offenders was from the very religious leaders of their churches. So I do not think that Jesus has a lot to say about consenting adults being intimate with each other. I can only remember like 3 times, I might be wrong, but I could remember 3 times that Jesus barely talked about sexual morality, and that is when he was talking about the adultery of straight men. And also in the same passage, when straight men cannot keep their eyes, their lustful eyes towards the wives of others. And the last one was when there was a woman caught in adultery in the Gospel of John, but that was not about what she committed, but it was about he who has not sinned cast the first stone. So the focus of Jesus in his life and ministry and preaching and words and acts of healing were the inclusion of the sick, the poor, and the marginalized. That was the focus of Jesus. So what is sin in this parable? What is so offensive to God in this story? In my mind, the sin we need to be focusing is the sin of indifference and apathy. Indifference against the large suffering of humanity and of all creation. Sin is when, as a people, a society, a nation, a human race, we allow our sisters and brothers and siblings to suffer and die when it is in our power to ensure that there is life and life of abundance for everyone and not just for few. Sin is when we do not care even when we can. Sin is when we can give so much yet choose not to. And sin is whenever the poor reaches out his or her hand and we decide to look away. And I committed that sin not long ago. I committed that sin, I think that was last week of August when I decided to go downtown. I wanted to see the architecture of the Catholic Cathedral of the Sacred Heart, and then also went to the Trinity Episcopal Church, the 100-year-old church structure. And so after I've seen them, I went home, I rode the metro train, and I sat across I was seated right across the door. And so the train went and made its stops. Have you this behavior, unconscious behavior, that whenever a door opens, you then look at the door? And so the door opened, and I turned. Maybe there's a good-looking guy coming into the door. But when the door opened in one of the stops, so I turned my eyes there, and there was this homeless man seated in one of the seats in the station, and he was obviously a homeless man. He looks dirty, he looks smelly, he did not have any shoes, and one of his legs was swelling. And so what I can just describe as a cinematic moment was I turned my eyes, he turned his eyes, he tried to reach out, asking for help to get into the train. And what felt like 10 minutes of thoughts, but was just a microsecond of thoughts, I thought to myself, oh, I don't want to go there and help him. I might dirty myself. His smell might rub over me. I might get a disease. I sure didn't want to get sick in Houston. And I just didn't want to go out and be left by the train and have this uncomfortable, awkward situation with this old homeless man. And so when he was reaching out, I turned the other way. And what was like 2 to 3 minutes that the train was staying there, he continued to reach out. And there was this young woman in blue medical uniform, had tattoos, and I assumed she was queer. I hope so, she was. I hope. And she stopped and tried to help the homeless man without thinking twice. And she tried to stop the door, then bring the man, and then stop the door and bring the man. But it was too much, and the doors closed, the train went. And what was another cinematic moment for me, I suddenly felt a sudden tug of pain in my gut as the train moved. I felt a sudden rush of pain in my gut. I felt shame and guilt at that moment, and I started to cry because at that moment I was not just the rich man. I was also the priest and the Levite in another Jesus story who turned the other way. And this is a sin from which I need absolution. Sin is when we have the power to help but decided otherwise. Sin is when we shut our doors and windows to our neighbors in need. Sin, in the song that we heard, is when we see kids in the street having not enough to eat and we pretend to be blind and not see their needs. Sin is whenever we say, I just don't care. It's not my problem. It's not an LGBTQ problem. Let them deal with it. And the question is, why? Are there no LGBTQ homeless people? Are there no LGBTQ poor? Are there no gay teens who are homeless because they were rejected by their parents? Are there no lesbian mothers who are asylum seekers? Evil, according to this gospel, is when a poor like Lazarus dies alone and no one gives the F word. And so what is our redemption? What is gospel? What can we consider to be salvation at this point? Gospel and redemption is listening and paying attention to the poor. Because there are actually things, there are spiritualities that can be only learned when you interface with the suffering. Gospel and redemption is compassion and care for those who are hurting and suffering. Gospel and redemption is dignity of labor through a living wage and universal health care. It is not true that poor people are lazy. Countless poor people work hard 14 hours a day, 16 hours a day in some countries, earning subsistence levels. Gospel and redemption is protesting the many evils of our society and of our world, holding the government and the UN accountable and to act. Gospel and our redemption is our shared responsibility for the common good. Our redemption is to ensure that no one ever has to eat pagpag. No one has to ever eat garbage. No one has to die poor, sick, and alone like Eleazar. Our redemption is to give our whole selves in the act of solidarity with those whose only hope and only help is in God. So you might ask the question, how do we do this? How do we do this? And I will end my sermon by reading the book of Acts. The book of Acts is from the same author. And the author gives us an idea, how do we do this? How do we proclaim gospel and redemption? And I hope you will think a lot of things regarding this. So Acts 2, chapter 43 to 45. Everyone around was in awe. All those wonders and signs done through the apostles. And all the believers lived in a wonderful harmony, holding everything in common. They sold whatever they owned and pooled their resources so that each person's need was met. In some translations, it says, there is no needy person amongst them. They followed a daily discipline of worship in the temple, followed by meals at home. Every meal a celebration, exuberant and joyful as they praised God. People in general liked what they saw. Every day, their number grew as God added those who were being saved. Dear sisters and brothers, siblings in Christ, these are the words of God for the people of God. And we say,